Good afternoon, Year 4. I hope you've all had a good day. It's been a good day here in school. Done lots of learning, science, some English about our new story, and we've been getting used to characters and that. So really, with this, you should have a good understanding of how to work out the traits of a character. Okay, let's keep going. Chapter 7. We remember he's escaped and he's up a tree, isn't he? I was woken by the orangutans stirring around me in the nest. They climbed all over me. I pushed them off. I was too sleepy to cope with them. They gave up on me after a while, and two of them began to wander off, climbing in and among the branches nearby. Still half asleep, I let them go where they wanted. I knew they'd come back if they needed me. One of them was trying to drink some rainwater from a hollow in a tree. Another was chewing on a young leaf bud, but the smallest of them stayed closer to me. She always did, never letting go of me, even as she gnawed one-handed on a piece of bark. All of them were alert to everything that was going on around them, always looking, listening, scenting. If there was any danger, they would very soon let me know. I was still too exhausted to care much about anything. I drifted off to sleep again, but I only slept fitfully. I remember I was having one of those strange, deeply disturbing dreams where you somehow know that you are only dreaming, but all the same it's terrifyingly real. All I wanted to do was to wake up, but I couldn't. I could hear the baying of hunting hounds. Una was standing there at the edge of the clearing, the fig trees all around. Everywhere the ground was littered with the bodies of dead and dying orangutans. Then out of the forest came the hunting dogs. Mr. Anthony was there with them, with his hunters, and the dogs were baying for blood. Una was trumpeting, tossing her trunk at them as the dogs leaped at her. All the trumpeting and baying sounded loud in my head, so loud that it woke me out of my dream. I sat up, suddenly aware that the little orangutans were clambering all over me, clinging to me for protection, that the jungle was alive with alarm calls. I realized then that the baying had not only been in my dream, but it was real enough. It was coming from somewhere below me in the forest, not that far away, and closer all the time. I could hear men's voices now. I saw them then, the hunters with dogs yelping and straining on their leashes, some of them with machetes, some with rifles. They were coming our way. I counted 2 dogs and half a dozen men with rifles, one with the red bandana, but none of them looked like Mr. Anthony. They were right underneath us now. There was nothing else to do but lie low in the sleeping nest, holding on tight to the orangutans, and hope and pray that they wouldn't move or whimper, that the hunters wouldn't look up and see us. I buried my face in their hair, willing them to be still, not to make a sound. I could hear the dogs yapping and yowling as they rummaged through the leaves at the bottom of the tree, searching for the scents that we must have left there. I was sure they must find it sooner or later, and it would lead them directly to us. I closed my eyes. I did not breathe. For several heart-stopping moments I lay there listening to them, snuffling about, pinning all my hopes now on the rain that had fallen the night before, that it might have washed away the scent of us. Then I heard them moving away. I could breathe again. I dared to look down and saw that one of the dogs was still reluctant to go. He was agitated, excited. I was sure that he had found something, that he was on to us. But the hunter in the red bandana yelled at him, jerked him on his lead, dragging him away. They were gone. For a long time afterwards I could still hear them moving further and further away into the forest, slashing and beating their way through it, shouting at one another as they went. With every moment their voices became more distant. It seemed an age before the chatter and screech of the jungle quieted down around us. Only then could I really be sure that they were gone. Even so, I knew I had to stay where I was with the orangutans, that the hunters and the dogs might not be gone for good, and they could be back. One thing was for sure. From now on, I must at all costs try and avoid moving about on the forest floor. That was how the dogs had found our trail. I couldn't risk it again. We would have to live as orangutans live, up in the trees, where we would be out of harm's way. But how would I do it? Or could I do it? I had no idea. But I knew there was nothing else for it. I had to try. Once I started looking, I soon discovered that we didn't need to go down onto the forest floor anyway. There was enough food up here to live on, and all the fruit that we would need, if only I could get to it. A few trees away, There were orange coconuts and some bananas too. I spotted the same kind of prickly fruit that Kaya had given us back in the cage. I had seen it growing high up in a nearby tree. I thought there was a good chance I could reach most of the fruit that I could see. It would be difficult and dangerous, but it had to be done. I would have to leap from one tree to another to get it. I knew I was taking my life into my hands, but I had no other choice. There was plenty of fruit there, and all we needed was there for days ahead. I had to try. I left 2 orangutans in the nest. The little one wouldn't be left. I made my bid for the fruit, climbing and swinging through the branches, never once looking down. I made it! I made it there and back, again and again. We would have all the fruit we needed, for a while at least. We were all right for a drink too. There was milk from the orange coconuts. It took a while to stab the way through the outer skin with a pointy stick to get the milk, but it was well worth the effort. I had to fight the little orangutans off to have my share. They loved it as much as I did. But we had to make do with water mostly. The orangutans always seemed to find enough from the giant leaves that they were so often filled and refilled with rainwater, and sometimes from the hollow trees where it always seemed to be plentiful. We might have had to share the water with the frogs and the beetle and all sorts, and it might not have tasted that wonderful, but it kept us going, kept us alive. Above all, we were safe up here, and that was all that mattered. The more I thought about it, the more I felt sure it was the best place to stay, that there was no point in running anyway. Down on the forest floor we could bump into hunters and their dogs at any time. I had no idea where they were, and no idea which way to go, so what would be the point? I was already lost, I knew that. I could be going round and round in circles forever in this jungle. I could even end up back near Mr. Anthony's mining camp, and that was the last place in the world I ever wanted to see again. No, staying put was best. Staying put was safest. So for many days and nights I tried to live as orangutans and gibbons did, high in the trees, feeding off them, living off them, hiding in them, sleeping in them. I kept reminding myself of a lesson Una had once taught me, that I had to set aside all hopes, all expectations, and just to live for today, because it was the only way to survive. But that was a great deal easier said than done. My constant hope was that Una might somehow find me. I kept the hope alive in my mind every day, every night. Often I'd find myself lying there in our sleeping nest, telling the little orangutans all about Una, about how she'd saved me from the tsunami, about how one day she would come and find us in the jungle. But it was a hope that was fast fading with every passing day. I went on telling them about her, promising them that she would come, because deep down I needed to keep believing it might be possible, that however unlikely it might be, a reunion with Una could happen. They seemed to love gazing up into my face as I was telling my stories about her, reaching out to touch my face with their fingers, and sometimes with their lips too. Kissing, I discovered, was not just for human beings, and nor was storytelling. I remember I was lying there once in the sleeping nest, telling them all about the farm in Devon, about Grandpa and the tractor, when I heard a sudden hooting from high above us in the canopy. It sounded like an owl. At once an image came into my head of my mum sitting on my bed when I was little, and telling me a story about an owl who was afraid of the dark. And here I was, like an owl up in the tree, telling a story, just as she had. I cried for her that night, and for Dad, for the first time in a long time. Living so closely together up in the trees, I was getting to know the 3 little orangutans as individuals now, and companions too. In a way it was a bit like being back at school again. These were the guys I hung out with now, my new gang, my best mates. We did stuff together. Not the same stuff, of course, as we did with Bart and Tonk and Charlie, but it was stuff all the same. I suppose that was why I decided in the end to call the orangutans Bart, Tonk and Charlie. They were all very distinctive characters, so I twinned them up with the best character of my friends back home, and they suited them best. The biggest of them, the strongest, and certainly the most pushy, and probably eldest, I called Tonk. He had less hair than the others, just like Tonk had back at home, and like that, he could be a bit boisterous and rough. But Tonk could sulk when things didn't quite turn out the way he wanted. Bart, on the other hand, was a gentler soul altogether, always in Tonk's shadow, but a lot cleverer than him. He was the one who could always seem to work out how to find the leaves with the most water in them, when none of the others could, or how to use sticks best when probing for ants. Ants, I discovered, were a special orangutan favourite. Tonk's hair was lighter in colour, and he had the deepest set, darkest, most thoughtful eyes. So the littlest of the three I had to call Charlie. I wasn't sure, but I'd always thought Charlie had to be the one that had belonged to the mother orangutan anyway, the one that I remembered from the day in the fig trees, the dark-haired one that the other mothers had all looked up to as leader, the one I'd seen falling out of the fig tree, the one that I saw hitting the ground, still clutching her baby. Charlie was definitely more of a loner, quickly becoming more adventurous than the other two, and increasingly independent of them, though still very attached to me, quite literally. She was also a girl. There's a way of telling these things, unlike the Charlie at school. It made me smile every time I thought how furious Charlie would have been if he knew he'd been turned into a girl. But then, of course, Charlie shouldn't really have been that upset, because Charlie was a name that could be used both ways, so to speak. So it's fair enough, I reckoned, to call Charlie was fine. Charlie might have been the most adventurous, but she was the most sensitive too, the most easily depressed, and by far the most affectionate. She and I had already become inseparable. She'd often wake me up in the mornings by prising open my eyelids, and then nose to nose she'd look deep into my eyes. She liked to do hugging too, lots of it, and kissing. She liked to kiss my nose in a particular, I don't know why. She had thin, wispy hair that stood up on top of her head, so that she looked in a permanent state of shock. Her eyes looked like upside-down commas, facing one another. There was something comical about her, but like a clown, always a sense of sadness too. Even when she was fooling around and showing off, she was the best athlete of them all, which was just as well really, because Tonk and Bart could gang up on her sometimes. But she always had the speed and the agility to swing away and get herself out of trouble. The boys could get jealous of her and were inclined to give her a bit of hard time, even if I gave her too much attention. So I did all I could to share my affection out as evenly as possible. In the end, I found that I couldn't stay up in the sleeping nest where we'd made our home for as long as I'd hoped. The trouble was that the little orangutans frequently fouled the nest, and it soon began to smell. And that brought the flies. Besides, we were fast running out of accessible fruit where we were. I was having to climb further and further from the nest to find it, taking greater risk all the time. If I'd have had the strength and skill, I would have been able to move through the trees like an adult orangutan. I'd seen on that terrible day in amongst the fig trees how they'd reach out, grab a branch, bend it, then let the spring of the branch swing them across into the next tree where there was more fruit. But I couldn't do that. I could climb well enough by now, and fearlessly too. I was balancing and leaping more confidently all the time, but I knew I'd never be able to swing through the jungle like an orangutan. I didn't have that strength, nor in my arms, or my shoulders, or my fingers. I just didn't have the flexibility. I realised that sooner rather than later I was going to have to risk it. I would have to climb back down to the forest floor and go on a search to discover another suitable tree, where enough fruit was going to keep us going. A tree from which I could climb across into others just like it, where the leaves were broad and large enough to collect water, and most importantly of all, where I could find a promising nest site with enough foliage around to hide us from any praying eyes on the ground. But I was still reluctant to make the move, to take the risk. As it turned out, it was something else altogether that finally persuaded me that we had to move on. One afternoon in the heat of the day, we were all resting in the sleeping nest. I heard the sound of rustling from somewhere high above us. I thought little of it, but the more it went on, the more the little orangutans became alarmed. They kept squeaking and darting frantic looks upwards. To begin with, I couldn't see what it was that they were getting so agitated about. Then I saw it, the dark shape of a large orangutan moving stealthily through the canopy. He was sitting there studying us now, scratching his neck, yawning, his eyes never leaving us. It was obvious he had no intention of going away. He'd come to stay. I didn't have the impression he was annoyed with us, and certainly not angry. He wasn't displaying or shaking the branches at us. But he wouldn't leave us alone, and the little orangutans were working themselves up into a frenzy of anxiety. It occurred to me, after a while, that the orangutan was up there, telling us in his own way that this was his tree, that we should move on, and that if we didn't, then things might just turn nasty. I realised by now that the only way I could calm the little orangutans down was to move, and move now. But even after I'd made up my mind, I spent just a few moments sitting in the nest, listening out for any telltale alarm calls from the jungle, before finally deciding that it was safe to move down. Once back down on the forest floor, all three of the orangutans clung to me more tightly than ever, terrified, I think, that the orangutan might be following us. I didn't see him or hear him again, and in fact I soon forgot about him altogether. But they didn't. I talked to them softly, hummed my songs to them. I had found they liked the Chelsea song the best, and the further we walked, the more I could feel them relaxing. I was becoming less worried for myself too, about being caught on the ground by the hunters and their hounds. I wasn't looking any more for a new tree to climb into. I was thinking of something entirely itself. It was the first stream we came upon that put the idea into my head. The same idea I'd had a long time ago when I'd been with Una, that I'd followed a stream, then it must lead me to a river, and I could follow any river to the sea. And maybe there was just a chance that Mum might be there, that she might have survived, that she might still be alive. I thought I'd put all of that out of my head a long time ago, but I found the hope was still there. It was possible. She could be looking for me right now. I couldn't stay in the jungle and hide forever, hoping that Una would come and find us. I had to get out. I had to try and find my mum. I would stick close to the stream and go wherever it led me. I would find a tree where we could lie up each night and feed as we went, just keeping on going. It was then, as we were walking along the banks of the stream, that I noticed that the little orangutans seemed rather nervous of the water. To begin with, they wouldn't go anywhere near it, but then they didn't much like being left on the bank either. The more they saw me enjoying it though, drinking it, swimming in it, washing in it, the closer they dared to come to the water's edge. Charlie was the first to dip her finger in to try and drink from it. Then all three of them were doing it, nervously still, but doing it all the same. But however much I tried to encourage them and tempt them in, they drew the line at following me into the water to swim. As we travelled on day after day, I never ceased to be surprised at how quickly they were becoming intimate to me, how quick to learn, even when it came to walking. Although they would generally go about on all fours when they were walking or running, they would sometimes get up on two legs, copying me, especially if they were close to me. Charlie in particular seemed to prefer it, and would often walk upright alongside me, holding my hand. I only had to throw a stick, and one of them would pick up another stick and do the same. And then, like as not, they would all join in. Whatever I did, they liked to copy and do the same too, except for swimming. When the time came each evening to find a tree for the night, they would help me make a sleeping nest. They'd been folding in the twigs and the branches, weaving them into a solid base, then pressing down fresh leaves for bedding. They were clever with it too, working things out for themselves, finding their own way of doing whatever it was I was doing. Branches I could not hope to bend. They managed with ease, and they seemed to know instinctively what branch was needed and where. There was such power in their arms, and in their fingers too. The longer we were on the journey down the stream, the more I came to wonder at just how similar we were. The orangutans seemed to be more capable of so many emotions and feelings: affection, jealousy, fear, pain, anger, sympathy, empathy, joy and sorrow. I saw that they learned just as we learn, by example, by trial and error, and like small children they loved the fun of play. It was when all four played together, hiding games, ambushing, chasing, wrestling with one another, that I became aware of just how much they trusted me now, and how much they saw me as one of them. As far as they were concerned, I was their mother, and as far as I was concerned, they were my children. And we'll leave it there. So, my little children at home, my orangutans, I hope you are learning as the orangutans here are learning. Another week to go, not long now, and you'll soon all be back in this classroom or with Mrs. Johnson or with Miss Dixon behind us. So look forward to seeing you. Enjoy your last day of the week tomorrow, start of the week tomorrow. Good luck with that. See you later.